Topic 2 in our three-part series today, the ACLU has posted an article titled, What 100 Years of History Tells Us About Racism in Policing. While Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. famously said, I look to a day when people will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Is the police a systemic racist organization, or are they objectively enforcing law on criminals? Eric.
Yeah, so I'm going to start by saying that the police isn't a monolith. Each department's a bit different. By and large, the American criminal justice system has built-in practices which enforce an execution which negatively impacts Black and brown people significantly more than white people. I think some historical context is important here. I think it's important to note that the idea of now policing does come from like English common law, but proactive policing, meaning like the policing of victimless crimes, drug crimes, for example, started with basically repurposing slave patrollers to do that job. And the 13th Amendment, while it did end slavery, it gave a loophole to incarcerate people, and I'm sorry, to enslave people, essentially to implement slavery while people are incarcerated. And as a result, what we have now is we have enforcement of crime has led to mass incarceration, and more Black people are incarcerated and doing labor in prison than we had slaves at the height of slavery. That started during the Clinton administration as a result of legislation like the 1994 crime bill, which Joe Biden was the prime architect of. Yeah. That whole era started mass incarceration and police militarization.
Joe, looking at the police, looking at this hyper polarization that the media is taking on it, I have to look back at what Dr. Martin Luther King said. He said, I look to a day when people will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Is a criminal, or is the police racist?
Police are racist. Now, to Eric's point, it's not monolithic. However, the entire justice system is definitely geared towards a key performance and indicators. Everybody wants to make sure they maximize their arrest records in order to get their bonuses, to get their receipts. The 1994 crime bill that Joe Biden put out came in with significant incentives for police departments that had high prosecution rates. So they went where the crime was. And in most of these cases, it was underserved communities across the United States. Because of the historic systemic racism, those underserved communities happen to be minorities, whether they were Black, Hispanic, and in some cases even Chinese. They are, simply to meet their quotas. Everybody says, no, there's no such, there's quotas. They had quotas, the key performance indicators were part of the 1994 crime bill. And they continue to practice on that because those key performance indicators continue to prove success time after time after time.
So moving into the Republicans' perspective on this, I'm a non-party affiliated voter. If you're talking to myself or even other party members of other parties that are looking to the Republican answer or solution to this, are the police racist, or are we just looking at criminals objectively?
As someone that thinks that there is a good amount of problems that exist within the current way that we do policing, we do have massive incentive issues, like Joe brought up. I think the racial focus of the narrative doesn't particularly help things. I mean, for example, I was a few days, I think it was a couple of weeks before Breonna Taylor, you had a no-knock raid that ended with Duncan Lamp in Kentucky getting killed as well. That story completely, kind of lost, had no media attention. The other one did, because the other one fit a particular matter, wanting to kind of highlight the racial aspect. The problem is that things like no-knock raids, are bad policy. It puts police officers in danger. It puts victims, the people that they are swatting in danger. These are bad tactics. These are not necessarily racially driven ones. I do think that it's very good to point out the fact that policing is not a monolithic. I'm welcome to hear both of our friends here say that. The differences, I think, at different locality levels matter. And what ends up happening is that, for example, in New York City, right, when you had broken windows policing, you had a stop and frisk, those policies did tend to predominantly impact African Americans in the city, but that's because the crime areas were predominantly African American areas, and so it was a byproduct of these high density urban areas where a lot of these intentional applies. Those policies, I'm not necessarily defending those policies, but when we look at governments that aren't properly serving the populations, they tend to be in high density city areas. And it just so happens that high density city areas are, for a variety of different reasons throughout American history, tend to be very high density centers for minority populations. And again, I think the real issue is that we have to get serious about the fact that cities are failing their constituents, which that ends up becoming, again, that ends up where you get those racial breakdowns there. And that's something we really need to address, because if you don't have good government in these cities, for one, we're already seeing people fleeing, but it leaves a lot of people in a far more vulnerable state than they should be.
Yeah, Eric, to that point, I mean, from a non-party affiliated person, I look at the media and it's just very sad both ways. The narrative of racism that they continue to push, especially when it comes to the police. When we live in 2020, moving into 2021, should we be judging people based upon the content of their character, or should we just follow the media and really go towards a race-based narrative?
I don't actually think this is a media issue. So I'm an activist myself. I've been assaulted in some of these protests, in one of these protests, by someone who was we were counter protesting anyways, that's not here nor there. I think the major thing that is important to note is, first of all, I'm going to agree with Tho that there is a problem of policing in general that needs to be dealt with. I mean, I think concurrently with the idea of the racial issue of policing. I think that the article from the ACLU that we just read was, it laid out a pretty clear and solid case. They talked about several different reports, government reports from different generations over the last century that that really get into like what the issue is and the crux of the issue, and why is there a situation where those communities are getting significantly more police than other communities.
What is the crux of the issue?
Well, the crux of the issue is poverty in these areas that lead and government policy over a long period of time that has led to Black and brown people being put into inner city areas and being placed where that's the only place where they can get property. And what they didn't really get into the whole idea of white flight that occurred over the course of the last century, but basically fear of and largely that's been due to fear mongering about Black people throughout this country. And so you have very like unofficial segregation still in effect, policies like redlining, for example, the issue of the way that loans were handled with Black communities versus white communities over a long period of time that, I mean, in some cases really hasn't ended yet, but officially ended in the 1970s. That still today affects those communities, and it causes the issue where you have those communities, and Black people have like 1/10 the wealth on average that white people do. Black people have a harder time getting jobs, and so you have an issue of poverty and segregation that is de facto not official anymore, that has led to this this idea. And now what you see consistently across all the data in various countries is that crime and poverty track really well together.
So Joe, moving from the right and left perspective, looking at a Green Party or third party perspective, is this racism? Is this the police? Or is this personal discipline?
It's systemic. It's part of the entire problem from the top to the bottom. Eric brought up some good points on the repackaging of slavery with the 13th Amendment. Reconstruction era actually made it illegal to be Black, which allowed them to put them in prisons. Slavery moved from a private industry to a public industry. The government owned it, government managed it. One of the interesting things over the years is habits that developed in these poor communities that were segregated were made illegal. That process continued to exist. The first drug law that put people into prison were opium laws in San Francisco. That was racist based because these were the Chinese immigrants that were coming over and working on the railroads. This also made a prison labor camp available for the railroad system at the time. So we continue to see this systemic problem over and over where they actually criminalize nonviolent behavior in order to put people into prison, to manage these labor camps, to provide cheap industry, cheap labor all across. So again, repackaging of slavery.
So we talk about this being potentially a police problem, a race problem, a personal discipline problem. But isn't it all back together saying that there's a police personal discipline problem when the whole system itself showcases that the police typically haven't been held accountable for their actions?
I think that's definitely true. I think one of the movements out there that is actually, I think, one of a potential, a great conservative approach to police reform is the growth of the constitutional sheriff movement, where you have sheriffs, that are refusing to enforce some of these lockdown orders, they're refusing to enforce gun control laws in the eastern parts of Washington. That's one of the problems. You're going to have more police misconduct the more that you criminalize things, and that includes whether it's vice crimes or whether it's shutting down businesses. I do think, though, going back to the point about poverty, I think this is absolutely correct. I think, though, it is kind of just washing away a lot of the complexity of this issue by saying, oh, well, it's just because of racism. If you look at the works of Thomas Sowell or Walter Williams and their very thorough histories of the economics of race in America, they'll point to the fact that Black communities were growing at a much faster rate in terms of stability and income growth after in the early 1900s, until you had this growth of the welfare state. You had perverse incentives in there that helped foster a community of single parent families doesn't matter what race you are, single parent families tend to correlate with worse outcomes. That doesn't mean that it's case in every scenario, but if you're looking at a large scale trends, that's definitely one of them. And going even to the point of, and what you tend to seeing is it is a class conflict here where poor people are easier to exploit than rich people for a variety of reasons, including better law services, things like that. I know it's come up several times now, the way that slavery just kind of transformed after the Civil War. There's a lot of truth to that. I know down here in Florida, I've got a buddy that's at University of Florida. He's a history, getting his PhD in history there. He looked at the turpentine industry. You had entire rules changed to allow counties to basically sell off inmate labor to turpentine farms because it was a very high physical enduring thing. Well, guess what? That was basically de facto slavery, but it was driven more by class. Again, it was poor whites and Blacks that were taken advantage of, rather than a purely racial narrative. So that's why, again, I think focusing purely on race ignores a lot of these deeper socioeconomic problems that do need to be addressed, because that should be the question to all of these things, is how do we genuinely eliminate poverty? And guess what? The answer is not printing out checks. It's not welfare. It's opportunities, and it's growing skill sets. And that's what really matters here.
Sure. Eric, I'm going to give you the last word on this in 30 seconds, but it sounds to me that racism really boils down to, especially when it comes to the police department, based on the ACLU's report itself, that it comes down to education. One, it looks like they talk about educating the police. Two, it comes also down to the content of the individual's character, right? Education on their end as well. So do you think that a lot of this can be solved through education?
No, I don't actually. Obviously education is important. I think that the report actually goes deeply into, and let me actually quote the report real quick. They said that the Minneapolis Police Department implemented trainings on implicit bias, mindfulness, de-escalation, and crisis intervention, diversified the department's leadership, created tighter use of force standards, adopted body cameras, initiated a series of police community dialogues, and enhanced early warning systems to identify problem officers. The hope was that these training programs would professionalize policing and reduce abuses that might trigger more protests. This was all before George Floyd was killed. None of it worked. So I think that at the end of the day, what the facts around this issue have taught me, at least, I could go into all sorts of statistics on this. One of the most powerful things for me is that the New York Police Department allocates about $175 million a year to misconduct lawsuits, and that's taxpayer money, right? That alone right there should tell you. To Tho's point, I'm not emphasizing that, hey, this is entirely a racial issue. I'm emphasizing that this is a systemic policing issue that happens to affect Black and brown people significantly more than it does white people on a percentage basis.
Hey guys, if you like this clip, make sure you give us a thumbs up. This is a 3-part series. We've got part 3 coming to you next. Hit that subscribe button and make sure you share our conversation on social media. We'll see you soon.